Hey, good morning, folks. Hope you're having a great week so far. It's Wednesday morning, and we're going to jump back in for some morning minutes in the Word. Now, we started a thought on Monday out of Matthew 22, whenever the lawyer came to Jesus and said, "What's the greatest command in all the Bible?" Remember, Jesus gave him a 2-for-1 special. First and greatest commandment, love God with everything, with all your being. Okay, that's just summarizing what he said. But then he said in the second commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself. We talked just a little bit about love on Monday. I mean, there's no way a 4 or 5 minute video could cover everything about love. We barely even scratched the surface. There's so much that could be said about love. As a matter of fact, just earlier this year, February, end of February, I think it was, I spoke for 3 weeks on the love of God and our love for Him and our love for others, extensively. But even that just scratched the surface. So on Monday, we spoke about 4 or 5 minutes about what it means to love and how that in everything that's been going on in recent days, what we've seen this last week on the news and the way people are treating each other, how that really Christians, if we would show the love of God, let God's love flow through us to others, we could change this world. Well, let's just briefly look when Jesus said, love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, who is your neighbor? I heard one person put it this way, and I can't remember who it was, so I can't give them credit, but it wasn't original with me. But they said your neighbor is anybody who isn't your family. Well, and of course, because we know we're going to love our family. I mean, that's we are to love our family, but we're not supposed to just stop there. As much as we love our family, we shouldn't stop there. We should also love our neighbor. So someone said, love your neighbor. Your neighbor is anyone who isn't your family. But Jesus did an even better job of describing it. Over in Luke chapter 10, again, somebody comes to Jesus and they're trying to trip him up and they ask him a question and they say, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And he said, well, what's the law say? And the guy says a few things and then he mentions love your neighbor as yourself. And then, Jesus kind of encourages that. Okay, that's good. But then the guy said, well, let me ask you a question. Who's my neighbor? And then Jesus gives what is perhaps one of the greatest parables that's ever been told. He goes into what we know as the parable of the Good Samaritan. And this is something, that's a phrase that we hear all the time, even today. If you stop and help someone on the side of the road who's having problems, you are called a Good Samaritan. If you jump in when someone's being assaulted and you stop it, you're a Good Samaritan. And so this story, though, that Jesus told to us, it's just a phrase, Good Samaritan, no big deal. But it comes from, like I say, Luke 10, where Jesus told this story of a man who was attacked by thieves and left on the side of the road half dead. And the religious people came by, the priest and the assistant, the Levi, they came by, they saw this man lying on the side of the road, and they kept on going. But then a Samaritan stopped, and he's the one, the Good Samaritan, he's the one that stopped and helped the man and paid for his bills to have him, taken care of and all of that. And at the end of that parable, Jesus looks at the people and he says, now, which of these was his neighbor? And they said, well, it was the Samaritan. Now, to you and me, that doesn't mean anything, okay? But that was huge to them. Let me tell you just briefly about the Samaritans. The Jews hated the Samaritans. You may have heard the stories. If Samaria was at the north of Israel, and if the Jews needed to go somewhere north of Samaria, they would go all the way around out of their way just so they didn't have to deal with the Samaritans. Again, that's another reason it was so odd. There's a story where Jesus said, I must needs go through Samaria. And the disciples would have been like, what? No, we don't need to go through Samaria. And so for him to say, hey, which one of these was the neighbor? And they had to say, well, it was the Samaritan. Let's just break this down. It was the Samaritan, the one that didn't look like them, the one that wasn't from the same place as them, the one that didn't talk like them, the one that worshiped different than them, the one that, maybe their financial standing was different than them. They were the opposite of what the Jews considered themselves to be. I mean, that's basically how you could look at that. But yet Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the second greatest command there is. That meant whoever that person is that you think of whenever we say love your neighbor, and the person you think and say, yeah, anybody except them. whether it's because of some prejudice that you have, whether it's because of something they've done to wrong you, or regardless of what your reasoning of why you can't love someone, Jesus says, yeah, that's the one. That's who you need to love. Because see, it's easy to love those who love us back. It's easy to love those who look like us and talk like us and like the same things as us. But Jesus says, love your neighbor. They could be completely different than you. Love them. So love like God. Let God's love flow through you to your neighbor, those that maybe you like, maybe you don't. You look like them, you don't look like them. You act like them, you don't act like them. You love God, they hate God. Whatever it is, let God's love flow through you to them. So love your neighbor as yourself. We'll come back on Friday and we'll finish out this thought. You guys have a great rest of the week. You're halfway there. Stick with it. Finish out strong. I'll see you on Friday.